Hey, everybody. Welcome to Undivided Live. I'm Lindsay Crane, and I head the content and community teams here at Undivided. And we are neck deep into IEP season. And if you're here, chances are you might be feeling it too. Maybe you're I have 1 week before the IEP and better start thinking about it kind of person, or do you start making lists and calls a month or two ahead of time? Let us know in the chat how long you give yourself to prepare for your child's IEP. And if you think you're a procrastinator, I can promise you, you're in good company here. So as we're going to go along today, I'd love for you to share your planning and prepping tips with everyone else. So throw your genius in the chat and we can all learn from each other because there's a lot to gather, to review, to consider, and to prioritize with your team. So whether you have a couple days or a few weeks, at some point, like it or not, it's time to get organized. So thankfully, Undivided education advocate and navigator Lisa Carey is back to alleviate the stress and hone in on the most important things that we should consider when preparing for our IEP meetings. Thus, the ultimate IEP Prep checklist was born. Lisa has advocated for hundreds of families during IEPs, including her own. She's also the mother of 3 boys with disabilities. Hello, Lisa. Welcome back.
Hi, excited to be here.
Woo. Our community manager, Donna, who I have to say, fresh back from Paris, so we can all be jealous of Donna right now, but Donna is back and she's with one of our Undivided navigators, Iris. They are in the chat with you. They're sending your questions to me and Lisa, so please fire away any questions in the chat and we're going to get to whatever we can. And if you still have questions after today or you want one-to-one support, our navigators love helping parents get organized, which is easy with our step-by-step guides and the Undivided Super Binder, all housed in our desktop and mobile app. And we all know that school stress exists far beyond IEP meetings, unfortunately. And that's why our navigators are available for boost calls and with just the touch of a button through the navigator chat in our Undivided app, because there's a lot to manage in our lives and we all deserve a partner. So Donna shared the link where you can learn more about our free Kickstart, where you can start working with a navigator within days. So another way you can start prepping with us is to check out our free parent resource hub. Donna's going to share the link in the chat where you can find all the article links that we're going to be sharing throughout our chat today and more. Our resources cover everything from IEPs to regional center to Medi-Cal, insurance denials, and more. You can find it all there. And lastly, if you want to receive all the latest articles that we're working on as soon as they're ready, you can sign up for our weekly newsletter so you don't miss a thing. So Donna's going to share that link as well. And then you should be all set. So now you have all this information at your fingertips. So let's organize. It is time to start building your ultimate IEP prep list. So before you even start prepping for that IEP, it's a good idea to root everything that you're doing in the why, right? What are we working towards? So Lisa, can you talk about creating a vision statement and why parents should consider presenting one at their child's IEP?
Yeah, sure. So before I answer your question, we have all been sick at my house, not COVID, thank goodness, but my voice is luckily working, but I'm a bit squeaky, so forgive me. So the why. So I like to think about, we're all raising children, but we're not actually raising children, right? We're raising adults. At the end of this, right, we're going to have adults. They're not going to be children anymore. So that's sort of your end goal, right? And so when you're thinking about the why, a lot of parents like to create a vision statement, which it can be whatever works for you. So when I say this, don't think, oh gosh, I have to write out this complicated paper. It can be a sentence. It can be lots of sentences. It can be bullet points. It can be long-term goals. My personal vision statement for my youngest is long-term goals that I hope that he will have accomplished by the time he finishes with the school district. So it literally says things like, we'll be able to navigate a campus independently. But other people will write a vision statement that resembles more like a mission statement that you might see a business have, that might say something like they want their child to have meaningful relationships and love learning and have a rich social life. So whatever works for how your brain works, but it's sort of a what is it you're trying to get in the long run? And it should be a living document, meaning if you have a 3-year-old and the vision statement that you write today is going to mostly be what you want. But by the time your child is a teenager, hopefully you can include some of what your teenager wants in there.
Right.
So
yeah. Exactly. It may grow as your child grows, right? Some of the big things maybe are going to always stay, but you can always adjust that. And we've heard from a lot of parents who've started presenting this at IEPs, and that it's really meaningful. It's a good way to remind everybody in the room what you're working towards, right? All of this is not just for this one meeting, right? It's building up, and hopefully a lifetime of good things to come. And so, Lisa, once we have our vision statement, we know what we're working towards. And so now it's time to gather pieces of everything that's been happening with our child this year and then organize it. And so before we talk specifics, I think it's important that we reiterate the 2 golden rules of IEP documentation: save everything and document everything. So Lisa, why are these rules so important when that IEP meeting comes around?
Yeah, so there's a few reasons why it can be helpful to save everything. And when I say everything, I'm talking about any work that comes home, whether it be, on the computer or physical paper, any notes or emails that come home from the school. You don't need to worry about, if your kid's in 9th grade, I don't necessarily care about kindergarten and 1st grade, though that's really cute for their baby book or baby box. But I'm talking about this school year and possibly the previous school year, depending where your IEP falls. If your IEP is in August or September, then yeah, you want to have access to the previous school year stuff. You want to document everything so that when you go to prepare for your IEP, you can remember. If your IEP is in, August, you're not going to remember what happened the previous September with great detail, most likely, right? And also, if you have a conversation on the phone or in person with someone at the school that you feel is significant, not how was your weekend, but if they say to you, that there's a new behavior happening, or the child's refusing to go to see the OT or whatever it is, right? Or they're falling behind in a subject, I would follow that up with an email to the teacher or whoever that staff member was, and just simply, I always talk about being cooperative and collaborative as a starting point, and just say, thank you so much for sharing this information with me. And to clarify, you shared with me that my child is having this new behavior. Please keep me updated if anything changes. And at least you've documented it in writing. So when your IEP comes, you can remember if it, that conversation took place. It also gives the school an opportunity to tell you that you misunderstood or they didn't present the information in a way that they meant to.
Right. Which I guess, Lisa, it's sort of the unspoken, I guess the 3rd golden rule that we hear over and over is if it's not written down, it didn't happen. Right. Which is why it's important to document everything, even if it's just your own notes.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So let's start gathering info, right? We're going to start with requests for the district. So let's assume that we have our IEP date. So what are some common things that parents might consider requesting from their school or district teams when prepping for the meeting?
Yeah, before I answer your question, sorry to do this to you. I just want to go back to your previous question. There's one thing that I want to comment that I do personally when I'm preparing for an IEP. I have a document on my computer because that's what works for me, right? You guys may want to use paper, your phone, whatever. And it is just, I call it IEP Notes in my child. And as the year goes on, even if the IEP is 6 months away and something pops into my head, I will put it on that document. Like, for example, that discussion I just talked about behavior, I might write, September eloping is getting worse. What's the plan to prevent? Right? Now, I may not wait 6 months to discuss this, but if it gets worse, I'm going to call an IEP sooner. I have this on my notes is my point. And so I kind of throw things on there to help me remember. And I'm sorry, I went out of order, but your question was, yeah.
Well, I have to say though, after you just said that, and Carey, here, she just said something great in the chat, which I'll put up here. She said, if anything in this letter is incorrect, please reply within a reasonable amount of time. Something, maybe good to put at the end of if you're following up with somebody on your team.
Yeah, whatever it is, that discussion is something important, and if it's a passing sort of behavior thing, you don't necessarily need to put that. But if it's, something of significance, you can put something like that.
Yeah.
Something that I'm sorry, my voice, see, I told you guys, something that I have done in the past too is, if it's super important that I get the school to respond to that email, just to say, hey, I got this email, I'll throw something at the very end that'll force a response. That's usually not relevant. This is kind of funny, but something like, oh, my daughter got these great flip-flops with rhinestones and can't wait to wear them to school tomorrow. And, the school's going to respond and say, oh, no, you're not allowed to wear flip-flops. No flip-flops at school. Have her bring a picture or whatever, right? And at least you've got confirmation they got the email. I've been known to do that. It doesn't, or do you still need a volunteer for whatever next week? Or do you have enough toilet paper rolls or something that sort of, even if they don't want to respond to whatever you said in the rest of the email, they'll typically respond there. I know it works.
No, it's good. You have to, sometimes you have to make sure everyone's on the same page, everyone's getting your information. And we'll be talking about this throughout too, but Jen, I put Jen's comment up there as well, that she likes to use the Undivided app to keep all of her documents. We have, our super binder and the app. It's really easy to type up your notes, put them in the binder, and you can, that'll be right next to anything else that you upload, right? All of these things we're going to be collecting from the district, which, we should, which I know was our question that we can go back to, Lisa, but what should we be requesting from the district at this point?
Okay, yeah. So when you have an IEP meeting coming up, there's a few things that you want to do. First, in California, you have a right to audio record your meeting. It's so funny because before COVID, I never would say the words audio record. But yeah, you have a right to record audio of your meeting. You just have to let them know with 24 hours in advance. You're not actually requesting permission. You're just informing them. You're going to want to, if there are assessments, not every IEP has assessments, but if there are assessments being done, you want to request a copy of the assessment prior to the meeting. This is super important because one of the main points of IDEA, which is, the federal law about special education, is the schools are required to facilitate meaningful parental participation. How can you meaningfully participate when you are just being presented something that is not in your language? And when I say in your language, I mean a speech therapist is presenting a report that's in speech therapy language, right? An OT is presenting an OT language. So I'm referring to that. How can you meaningfully participate, make decisions, ask questions if you're just being presented the information right now and you've got to make decisions and respond right now? Most people can't. And so what I tell parents is, when you sign that assessment plan, because anytime they do assessments, you're going to consent. You can write directly on the assessment plan that you want copies prior to the meeting. Then when you get your meeting notice saying we're having the meeting this day and time, you can also write your request again on there. And if you still don't have them when you send your notice that you plan to audio record, you can ask a third time. Right there, I plan to record, please provide assessments. You can also request a draft of the IEP or draft of the goals, or drafts of the PLOPs, which is the present levels of performance. Some districts, if you're not in California, some parts of the country call PLOPs PLEPs, which is present level of educational performance. And I do want to say that not all districts will provide drafts. So don't leave this and say, well, I can't get a draft for my district. Yes, a lot of districts don't, and they actually are not required to. A lot of districts are concerned that by providing a draft, it appears that they're making decisions outside of an IEP meeting, and so they don't want to provide it. So don't be surprised if that happens. And then the last thing is, work samples. If you have an OT assessment and they tested the fine motor skills, or even work samples from the classroom. If the teacher's not been sending home classwork or whatnot, ask if they have any work samples you can review. And then the last thing, which kind of goes back to the draft IEPs, is that if the present levels reference data, or the draft IEP is referencing data, especially, like for behavior, sometimes they're going to be taking data, ask to see a copy of the data or have that provided to you.
Yeah, very important. I can't tell you how many times that I've talked to families who've requested that, and it doesn't exist in a lot of times. Or you can see that there's like 5 pieces of data that maybe were taken right before an IEP. So when you're talking about a whole semester of progress and there's only, maybe a handful of pieces of data, then, that's just part of the story. So these are some of the big requests from the district, Lisa. What do we need to gather from our child's private and non-school care teams?
Yeah. So if your child is seeing outside providers for therapies like speech or OT, you want to ask them for any reports or data. Now, they may not have a report and they may say, do you need me to make you a report? Not necessarily. Okay. Some outside providers like ABA agencies are required to create reports every so often for insurance. So they will probably have a report or a recent report. If it's somebody that doesn't have that requirement, you just want to kind of get their input from them. What are you working on in speech with my child, right? And how is my child progressing? And these are the school goals that they've had. Have you noticed any improvement in this area? If the school goal is, an articulation goal, a speech therapist, and typically an articulation goal will specify what sounds they're working on, right? So the private speech therapist should easily be able to say, oh yeah, I'm hearing those sounds. No, I'm not hearing those sounds. If there's any work samples from that, OT or whatnot, you want to get those. And then I also say it's good to get any recommendations from them. If they say, oh yeah, they're doing really well in this area, I would love to see them working on this other area, get their recommendations so you can at least sort of have some input on the goals. And then the last thing is, if you have a medical child, you're going to want to just touch base with their doctor to see if their doctor has any concerns about their attending school. Oftentimes, if your child is a medical kid, you already kind of know this, and it may not be any sort of change, but there are certain changes, like in Los Angeles, kindergartners don't do PE. They start PE typically in first grade. So your doctor might say, well, now your child's going to first grade. For PE, only low impact activities or something like that. So it can't hurt to touch base with the doctor if your child fits that category.
Absolutely. And lastly, what do we need to gather from our child or our own records?
Yeah. So if your child is, able to communicate however they communicate, I would find out from them, to the best of their ability, how school is going. What is their perspective, right? What is their story about school? For a little bit older children, if they are the kind that are going to say, I don't know, everything's fine.
13-year-old, I get that.
Yes, I have 2 teenagers and a 10-year-old. So yeah. So you can also do it a little bit differently and say, tell me 3 things that are going great and 3 things that you want changed, or 3 things that are not going well, or however works for your child. That's one way to do it. Another thing you're going to want to gather is, and I also want to say, if your child is not communicative, I have 2 that are and 1 that is not. Okay. We know how to read our kids. So just think about what messages you've been getting from your child in their nonverbal way when you pick them up and drop them off, right? At the beginning of the year, were they super happy to get out of the car? And the last couple of months, you're having to physically pull them out of the car, right? That is something that they're communicating and telling you. So, think about that too when you're, doing that. The other things you want to get from your kids, or maybe your own records. We already talked about homework and classwork, so work samples. So if you have maybe a teenager who hides everything, asks to see their backpack, their binder, or go in their room and dig around and see if you can find some stuff. The progress reports, report cards, teachers' notes, emails, the things we've already talked about.
Look at Google Classroom, I would have to say, right?
Right.
I mean, if you never see anything, you can at least log on to the Google Classroom and you can see a record of what's happening.
Right. And whatever your school, almost all the schools have something. They have Aries, they have Schoology, they have, I mean, the list goes on and on. So make sure that you have access with, to those things. So you can see what assignments are being turned in and what aren't, what grades are there, and so on. That's really important.
Yeah. And Sherry, I see Sherry made a great point too. A lot of people, I know a lot of parents have done this. She said, I'm having my son's second portion of his IEP and inviting his private speech and floor time providers, which
fabulous.
That's amazing that you can wrangle that, Sherry. And so, all right. So Lisa's just gone through a lot, right? So we've gathered a lot. And so now's the fun part, right? It's time to review. And I know this can really feel overwhelming. It can be overwhelming. So let's break it down. So we're trying to put together our child's story from the past year so we can learn what's working and what isn't. And we use this information to inform how they'll reach their goals next year. So I like putting everything I have in date order. This is just me, because that can be an important note, right? Let's say my child was identifying numbers in September and working on those same numbers in May. That may raise some questions that I didn't know that I had. So let's take a couple of examples of what we've gathered. And Lisa, it'd be great if you can give us some top tips that we can consider while reviewing, because again, it can be really overwhelming. So assessments, right? School and private assessments. What do we need to pay attention to?
Right. Well, oh, there goes the voice. Sorry, guys. So the first thing that you guys have, I'm going to repeat this. If you've ever listened to me on a Facebook Live or read our articles, I always say the same thing. Get a couple highlighters out and use one highlighter for strengths, one highlighter for weaknesses, or whatever you want to do, right? When you're reviewing an assessment, the first thing I always ask a parent is, does this feel like your kid? Was there anything surprising? Right. Sometimes they'll say, this didn't feel like my kid at all. Or, oh yeah, that's my kid. Right. So just, what did it feel like when you read it? Were you shocked? Were you surprised? As you're going through it, if you have questions on the assessment, I always say, put questions in the margins right next to where it came up, so that when they're going through the assessment during the meeting, you remember the question at the right time when the report is reviewed. You said school and private. If you do have a private assessment, compare them, right? You want to make sure if the OT says the child can't draw a circle and the school OT says they can draw circles all day long, there's a disconnect, right? Mm-hmm. So you can compare them, and that can provide some helpful information. I don't remember what I was going to say. How funny is that? You said assessments, and I was starting to think about progress reports and classwork. So that's what threw me. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I was going to say after, because this is, a high level, right? We've done entire hour-long, events, which if you look at our resource hub, you can find that when I've talked to, Lisa and I have talked about assessments. So we're doing high level, but I think those are such important notes. Again, everything you've gathered is what you're reading here, lining up with what what you see, and what other professionals are seeing. Exactly. And if not, then that is absolutely a conversation. And so, Lisa, you mentioned progress reports. Let's talk about that next, because I feel like that's something that a lot of parents, they're kind of paying attention to, but maybe not really. So what do we need to be looking at when we're looking at our child's progress reports?
Yeah, progress reports and progress reports and report cards are basically the same thing in my head. I know to the school that they're different because one is official and one is not, but they're the same thing. I'm one of those that kind of tends to ignore most of what the progress report shows in the grading, because my child's on a modified curriculum. So it's kind of meaningless. What I pay attention to the most, and by the way, I'm not telling anyone to ignore, I do look at it, but what I'm getting at is the important part is the comments. Whatever the teacher wrote in that progress report or report card, I want to know how that kind of lines up with the present levels in the IEP. Keep in mind that teachers are given, I don't know the rules exactly, but they have to present things a certain way on progress reports and report cards. They're supposed to use certain phrases and avoid other phrases. But, if a teacher is saying their participation, for example, in this trimester, so-and-so's participation has improved, and then you get to the IEP and they say, oh, it's gotten worse, you can find out what the disconnect is. I don't think that anyone is necessarily lying, but I want to make sure that when we're writing goals and planning for the next year for the child, we're understanding where we're starting. You can't plan to go somewhere if you don't know where you're at. So this is really about figuring out where we're at. And the same thing with homework or classwork or work samples from providers, if there are. It's adding to the story. It's just part of the story. Is it progressing or regressing? Hopefully not, right? If suddenly a child's losing a skill, that's very significant. Or is the child progressing, and are they progressing enough?
Right. Absolutely. And in the example that I gave just a minute ago, like, my child might be identifying the same numbers in September and May. We could look at that in two different ways, right? She may show no understanding or progress towards her goal within that time frame, doing the same work all year, and that tells a story. Or my child is identifying numbers in September and she did well on tests and has work samples showing that she knows those numbers, yet she's still doing the same work in May. That also tells a story. So, like Lisa said, we have to look for how that work is progressing and how our child is progressing or not progressing. So, because reviewing all these different pieces of information from our child's year can start informing or shaping our list of concerns. And a common recommendation that we hear is that parents should send their list of concerns to the IEP team before the meeting. However, there might be some considerations in what we include. Do you want to expand on that, Lisa?
Yeah. So I it's funny because I try not on these lives to say anything too controversial. And so there's going to be two different schools of thought on this. I don't recommend people do this. I do recommend more like an agenda that might list out the items the parent wants to discuss, like maybe, you want to discuss the behavior plan or home communication or social skills. That's okay. But I don't like people that I work with or for my own kids to get too into the weeds of in detail. And the reason for this is because if you are going to ultimately be seeking something the school doesn't want to give you, this gives them a great opportunity to prepare their arguments against it before you've been able to present your argument for it, if that makes sense. So if I really would rather this discussion be within the confines of the IEP meeting that's being recorded, instead of them having, going and talking to this person and talking to that person and looking up this regulation and coming back prepared to say no. It's just, but there are advocates out there who will absolutely disagree with me, and many of them are really amazing, wonderful advocates. So, yeah,
I think we always want to approach IEPs with collaboration, but right. We also do have to, sometimes there is some strategy around IEPs, and at the IEP, you're going to put it out there, you're going to say what you want, but there are ways that you can phrase things. You can maybe say there's concerns with behavior instead of saying in your concern, like, we're requesting, a one-to-one. It's like, there's maybe ways, like you're saying, Lisa, to make sure, like, here's things we want to discuss without going into detail. In the list
and the agenda idea too, that I mentioned, where I said oftentimes I look at this as like an agenda. I don't even do that for most IEPs, but where I do that is when I'm going into an IEP with a parent who has historically not been heard and not listened to, or gets to the end of the meeting and is told we're out of time and they never got to discuss what they want to discuss. That's when I'll use an agenda provided in advance. To sort of force the school to make time for the parent. I have one particular, school that is notorious for this, and I will always provide an agenda of what the parent wants to discuss in advance.
That's great. And Allison, I see Allison's giving some great recommendations in the chat about how her students are not on the modified curriculum. And she's talking about like tools to really, she has to compare progress with the rest of the class, not just IEP goal progress. So definitely check out the chat. Those are some great suggestions that Allison's sharing as well. And speaking, talking about like what we're going to be asking for, right? This agenda, there's going to be things every IEP, we're going to have requests, maybe little, maybe large. And it's important that we prepare for our requests, even if it's just organizing thoughts in our head. We can't just go in with all of our very valid emotions and say, this is how it should be. I mean, you can, but it's also a good idea to back up those emotions with some hard facts. So I want to take two major concerns or requests that we hear over and over. And I'd love for you, Lisa, to share the best way that parents can prepare for these requests so we can really understand the right way to represent our child's needs in an IEP. So I'd like to take two examples, aids and placement. And so number one, let's take a request for a one-to-one aid. How should a parent prepare?
Okay, so if you believe your child needs an aid, I recommend, first off, I am not against aids. I have a child with an aid. Actually, 2 of my 3 kids had an aid. I think aids are very valuable when used appropriately. So I would really think about why your child needs an aid. I would make sure that you're not saying your child needs an aid just because you're nervous about them going to school, because if the goal is an adult, right, we want them to learn independence, and it can be hard with an aid because aids are often not used well. So really give some thought, maybe make a list for yourself. Why does your child need an aid? Does your child need an aid from drop off to pick up? Does your child need an aid only for academics? Why is the aid there? Is the aid there because they have safety concerns, like they might elope or climb or skin pick or something? So have a clear understanding of their needs will help you present your request in a clear way. Also, just like any sort of negotiation, if you feel your child needs an aid only for academics per se, that gives you some negotiating room with this district, with the school. You can say, well, my child needs an aid. And then as the conversation goes on, you can say, you know what, actually, I think they'll be okay during lunch and specials. And they just really need it for academics to refocus, right? Obviously, if the aid is needed for safety, you don't have that room. You do need from drop off to pick up. And that's absolutely valid. So just have a clear understanding before the meeting without your emotions, when it's just you and your partner or friend, whatever, putting together kind of what specifically a child needs an aid for, the bathroom, for safety, for attention and focus. Like put together a list, and maybe put together a list of what your child doesn't need an aid for. Because even if they do need an aid full time, there's going to, and let's say they get a full-time aid, then there should be discussion about that aid's role in school. And the times that the child may not necessarily need an aid, then you can ask them to please have the aid back up, be 6 feet away so they're available, but so the child can learn some independence. For example, maybe they do really well in music because it's a preferred subject, it's a preferred thing. They want to be there. Then the aide might be able to sit across the room and give some space during that time. So just really think about it is really what my answer is.
Well, and is there anything that a parent needs to bring to the table to show these needs, Lisa? Is it enough that we're saying, I mean, obviously that this is what they need. Do we need a report from somebody else? One of our other, one of their providers. Is that a good idea for parents to bring?
So it depends. If this is your child's first IEP, absolutely. Because they've only, when your child is 2.5 or 3 and they go in for that assessment, they met your child for what? An hour with 40 people. I'm being dramatic, but that's what it feels like to most parents in the room at the same time, asking questions. And, so yes, absolutely. Especially if it's for safety. If the child has already been at school, they're going to heavily rely on how the child behaves at school. So if the child, for example, elopes at home but never at school, you've got a really hard argument because the child's been at that school, they've observed the child at school, the child's never eloped. It doesn't matter really if the child does it all the time at home, if he never does it at school, right? So potentially it can be helpful, maybe not. Where it's absolutely required is when it's medical. So if you have a child that has medical needs and they have an aid for medical reasons, then you're going to need some forms filled out by the doctor that explains whatever it is, a G-tube or a trach or a seizure protocol or whatever it is.
Okay. Well, all right. Which makes sense, right? Depending on what we're asking for. And I know I'm like I'd rather have that backup, as much as it's required, right? It's always a good idea, so you don't get the possible like, oh, okay, that's what mom says, right? It's always good to have backup if it makes sense for the scenario, right? You don't have to overdo it in every
situation. I do think backup's important, but if the child has been in school, then they're going to have their own observations of the child. And if you bring in something that's totally different, it doesn't mean that you're going to prevail the way that you want.
Right.
And again, and if you disagree with what they're seeing at school, or you don't think it's correct, that's a whole different discussion, by the way. Like that doesn't mean, oh, we have to accept what they say. There is, a different Facebook Live, but you can do independent assessments and stuff too. So
yes, absolutely. Yes. IEs. All right. So number 2, placement, right? So I want to kind of cover, both ends of the placement spectrum. So first, what is the most important thing for parents to prepare if they're reporting or if they're requesting inclusion for a student with more involved support needs? How do we prepare?
Okay. So, I think that this is kind of my opinion, this part, but I think schools are sort of become numb to walking in with all of our scientific articles about why inclusion is best, or I'm sorry, not scientific, the studies that we have on why inclusion is most beneficial. I think they've seen them 100 times and they're not listening anymore. So what I do, I mean, sure, bring that stuff in. I'm not telling you not to, by the way, but what I would think about is how would your child benefit from inclusion, specifically your child? What skills do they need to work on that would be better worked on with neurotypical children? For example, would speech models be helpful? If your child was placed in a special education classroom, are they really good at imitating, and would they likely imitate and pick up other behaviors that are not necessarily the right ones or the ones we want? So think about what would benefit your child in inclusion. And then you can also write goals that would require typically developing children, as far as, for example, speech goals. That's a really good place to do it, right? And you can write right into goals that you're looking for your child to engage with the community, the school community at large, not just one little classroom, right? So that's one way to approach inclusion.
Well, I love that too. And I was actually going to ask you, so I'm glad that you sort of said the studies, because like you said, I mean, but it's important to sort of, it is important to at least know when you're going in how to frame, what 40 years of research has shown, but then also, like you said, talk about specifically why you're asking for that and how you want that to benefit your child, right?
Right. So make it relevant to your child.
Yes.
Right. Like the studies are important. The studies have value. But we want to talk about this specific child and how it's going to affect and benefit that child.
Right. And then on the other end of the spectrum, right, let's say we have a family who wants to request a non-public school placement for their child. So how should they prepare for that request going into the meeting?
So just to I want to make sure everyone knows what a non-public school is versus a private school. A non-public school is a school that is not public, that has a contract with your district to educate children from the district. So when a child's placed in an NPS, the school that they were at previously, they're still considered a student of that school. So you'll still have IEP meetings. That school that they were at prior will participate in the IEP meetings, and they're still considered a public school student. A private school, there is no contract, and there typically is no IEP that the private school engages in. So if a family wants an NPS, there's a lot that goes into it. I mean, the first thing I would do is obviously go tour some NPSs and make sure you actually want it, make sure you're happy, you like the school, tell the NPS about your child. And then I would recommend that you consider speaking to an attorney or an advocate before bringing it up in the IEP, so you can make sure that you cover all your bases. Yeah. But an NPS is something that they can put on an IEP and give you in an IEP meeting presuming that the NPS accepts your child. A private school is not something they can put on an IEP or give you in an IEP meeting.
Right. And I see that we did have a question from Mandy. She was asking, would diapering count as medical? Probably some of those, the medical.
Not generally, no. Generally, no. I'm saying generally no. And I mean, if there was like a colostomy bag or something like that, yes. But just a child who's in diapers, no, that would just be a regular aid support. Somebody has to take them into a private restroom. Most schools will have a private restroom, often in the nurse's office, with equipment for changing older children. Yeah.
All right. And speaking about placement, I did want to ask, because we had a conversation recently that a lot of families want to tour available placements before the IEP, which would make sense, right? But it's not always that easy or straightforward, right, Lisa?
Yeah. So a tour before the IEP, most schools aren't going to share with you, and not always, okay, but a lot of schools won't share with you what they're considering, because that could be viewed as predetermination. You can certainly ask and say that you want to take a look before the meeting. You can even try to phrase it and say, well, my kid is 3 and you only have, this type of class and this type of class and this type of class. So can I just go tour all 3, right? But don't be surprised if they say no. When they do offer you a placement in the IEP that is a first-time placement or a placement that is different than where your child is now, I recommend that you ask at that point to view this placement. Since COVID, we've had a lot of difficulties with that, and we could go into a whole hour discussion, but I'll quickly say that denying you the right to view placement is denying your right to parental participation. How can you sign and agree to an IEP if you have no knowledge about what it is you're agreeing to? So, but I would definitely view any new placement before you agree to the IEP.
Yeah, for sure. Just might not be able to be before the IEP.
Right.
Right. All right. So at this point, we've reviewed our child's paper trail. We've made our list of concerns. We're prepared to talk about those concerns. So now let's think about where we want our kids to go, our priorities, their goals. So we'll have our own ideas, as will our child's team. So if at all possible, it can be incredibly helpful to touch base with members of our child's IEP team before the IEP meeting. So Lisa, what should parents talk about during that check-in call if we can make it happen?
I would ask about progress. I would ask about what's working and what isn't. I would ask if they have any new goals to propose. Share if you have any priorities that you might want them to start working on. Share if you have any new diagnosis that would affect things. I will tell you, though, that the providers may not talk to you and instead just tell you they're working on the present levels and will present in the meeting. I've come across that where they say, oh, I'm working on the present levels, I'll present in the meeting. And this comes from a place where a lot of the schools are really worried about being perceived as having IEP meetings outside of an IEP meeting, or IEP decisions or discussions outside. And they've directed their service providers to not do it when an IEP is coming up. So it is what it is. But those are the things that I would, ask about.
Right.
And ask them what happens in the sessions, by the way. I don't know why I forgot that. What happens, right? Do they go into the classroom and work with them in the classroom? Does the child want to be there with them? Is the child resistant? Do they take the child from the classroom to their office? And if so, is the child not doing that transition well? So instead of meeting with the child for half an hour, they only get 10 minutes by the time they get the child from the room across campus into the room, settled, So ask what it looks like when they hold their sessions with the child.
That's a really good point. And also, Lisa, I guess we need to cover, is there anything that parents should not communicate to their team ahead of the IEP when they're having discussions?
Yeah, I'm all about collaboration and cooperation, but if you're considering due process, it may not be in your best interest to tell them that. That would be a discussion that you'd want to have with your attorney or your advocate. other than that, I like to tell parents to pretend like you're a judge or your grandmother in the IEP meeting with you. So be calm and professional at all times. That is not to say that you can't be emotional and cry. These are your kids. Okay. So go, I cry in my own kids' IEPs. So there you go. I do it even though I tell myself I'm not going to, but just try to pretend like there's a judge or your grandma sitting in the room, and try not to be disrespectful or yell at them or do anything that could be perceived by people who aren't been a part of this process as unreasonable or disrespectful.
Right. Well, still being honest, obviously, about like what your child needs, but trying to keep.
Absolutely. And if the school's done things that are upsetting to you, you can absolutely tell them. Just do so in a way that your grandma would be proud of. Right. Well, or the proverbial grandma, what your grandma's like. Right, the proverbial grandma, right. The stereotypical grandma, right? Like I would not cuss in front of my grandmother, right? So that's why, or a judge or your boss or whoever might help you temper your temper.
Right. Envision that person, right? Whoever that might be.
Right. Right.
So, I mean, obviously, because if we talk to our child's team, ahead of time, the hope is that we can mitigate too many surprises during the IEP, right? Hope. But let's also talk about the most important things to flag when we're reviewing that draft IEP, because like you said, we might be getting that draft IEP before the IEP, if we're lucky, or maybe after. But I really like to get specific about some of the bigger things that we've been prepping for. So again, we really know what we're looking for. So what are the most important questions that parents should be asking themselves when they're reviewing present levels?
Yeah. The first thing I would make sure is, do I understand all the terms and all the data that's being shared? If I don't understand certain terms, you can ask your private provider. You can look it up. We have Google. You can ask for clarification from the school, which, they might just say, we'll discuss that in the meeting, right? So I would, go through and look up any terms or data. If you don't, one of the areas that is a challenge is when you look at testing, psychoeducational testing, academic testing, right? What is a T-score? What is a scaled score? What is, the 1 standard deviation or 2 standard deviations, right? A lot of people don't understand that. And I'm going to be honest with you. I've taken many, many classes and I've looked at it over and over, and I still have to look at a bell curve occasionally to remind myself, Yeah. Like, so taking the time to understand what all of those things mean can be very helpful.
All right. So what are the most important questions we should be asking ourselves when reviewing goals?
The most important thing that I can say about goals is this goal appropriate in 1 year from now? I've had so many parents say to me, well, this goal is it's so hard. My child isn't doing, whatever. This goal isn't going to work. But I have to remind them that if your child, if this is March and your child's in 2nd grade, right? This goal is supposed to be accomplished when they're at the end of 3rd grade. So almost a 4th grader, right? So remember to think of it as where we want them to be in a year from now, not right now.
Right. And I see we have some questions coming up, and I'm going to get to those in just a second. How can parents, or what are the most important questions that we should be asking ourselves when we're reviewing accommodations?
Are they realistic? Do they cover all the areas they should? Are there accommodations or are there other accommodations that you or a provider use outside of school that could be helpful to the school? Remember, accommodations are almost always as needed, meaning not every accommodation will be used every single day. A lot of times parents, like, for example, let's say an accommodation is a graphic organizer, right? Well, if your kid sits down and starts the assignment and is doing really well without the graphic organizer, the teacher isn't going to say, oh, wait, you need a graphic organizer, so it's going to be as needed almost always. So just think about, what do you do at home? You know, do you prep for transitions at home, and does that help prevent a meltdown? Then prepping for transitions could be a combination at school, you know, for example.
Okay. And what about the same question, but for modifications? What are the most important questions that we should be asking ourselves when reviewing modifications?
The most important question is, do you as the parent understand the significance of modifications to your child's academic career? And what I mean by that is that a lot of parents don't realize that when you are a modification is usually having your child do something that doesn't meet the standard for the grade. Modifications in high school means your child's not going to get a regular, typical high school diploma. And that may be okay for your child in your situation, but it's awful when a parent doesn't realize that that's what it means. It's just awful. So make sure you understand what the modifications mean. And then if there is going to be modifications, who's responsible for those modifications? Who's doing them? What do they look like? I would ask those questions.
Yeah, because just because they're written in, it's much harder to then figure out who's doing that. And especially as you're getting to secondary and they're in lots of different classes, important discussion to have of who is responsible. All right. And so then last big bucket with this, what other questions we should be asking when we're reviewing related services?
This one, it's kind of hard to know, but I would be looking at, are the minutes offered adequate to reach the goals that have been set? So, you know, for example, if a child has 4 major speech goals, right, and they're offering 20 minutes of speech a week, is that enough to meet all of those goals? Probably not, right? 4 goals, 20 minutes a week, that's a lot. So just make sure that the goals match the minutes. And by the way, this is also a way to get more service minutes. If you think about it, if your child needs a lot of speech and this is super important to you, make sure you have a lot of speech goals because the minutes need to support the goals.
Right. And Robin asked a question, you know, that unfortunately a lot of us have to deal with. And she says, what if they're not reaching the goals that are listed out by the time they had documented? So you know, you're reviewing everything and you're looking at those progress reports and you're realizing like a lot of those goals, they haven't been met. What should parents do?
Yeah. So I would first obviously be reasonable and think about if there's any reason why that's obvious to you. Like maybe the child missed a couple months because they had a medical procedure or, you know, COVID or whatever. Is there a reason that you're aware of right there, right? If the child didn't reach their goal, then obviously that's a question in the IEP meeting. Why did he not reach the goal? I would love for you to find out what their answers are. The reason it's significant is because when the goal was written, everybody in the IEP team agreed that the goal was realistic, agreed that the supports and accommodations and services were put in place for the child to meet that goal. So if the goal wasn't met, something went wrong, right? Just by definition, something is not going right. So I would definitely ask. It is rare that I recommend a goal be, I'm going to say never recommend a goal be repeated exactly the same. There are some goals that you're going to want to keep, but you might want to change some part of it. Examples might be like if you have a potty training goal or a toilet training goal, right? We're not going to just say, oh, didn't meet it in a year, we give up, right? We're going to still keep working on that, at least most of us, but maybe you want to change it, right? Maybe you want to change the amount of prompts needed, or you want to change the amount of adult support needed, or maybe you're going to add in some accommodations that include an alarm or a vibration on a thing every hour to remind the child, whatever it is. But repeating the goal exactly as it is again is not a good practice.
No. And Evie also asked, here, I'll put yours up there, Evie. You know, how can we encourage the team to create goals that are more aligned to the class curriculum and or that can be worked on across all settings, not just a specific service provider, which is such a great point, right? You know, we don't want kids working on, you know, handwriting like during their little session pulled out of a class and not while they're doing handwriting, you know, throughout the day in all of their classes, if they still teach handwriting. I don't know. I know it's getting less and less now. But.
Well, I mean, I want to answer it kind of backwards. So
Yeah.
working across all settings, that can be actually right in the goal, right? You can say that the goal needs to be met across different settings or generalized, right? And then when you when they assign who's responsible for the goal, for example, let's say it's a writing goal. And so it's the OT, right? When I say writing, I'm talking about the physical act of writing, and it's the OT. Then you can have the teacher, classroom teacher, also be responsible, classroom teacher and OT. That'll also help. Goals that are aligned with the curriculum. Oh, this is just an area Lindsay would love to talk about for hours and hours and hours. I love you, Lindsay. But so if your child is on, not modified work, so they're on the regular curriculum, okay, you can go and we'll post it in the group later today. So don't panic, Donna, trying to find this. But there are the state standards that you can easily get off the California Department of Education website. For kindergarten through 12th grade, they're called state standards. For preschool, they're called learning foundations. And that's what their goals should match up to if they're on the curriculum. If they are not on the curriculum, because, you know, they're on modified curriculum, then there is this thing called core connectors. And core connectors basically break down the state standard into smaller chunks. So, for example, let's say the state standard is to write a paragraph. And usually the state standards are a little bit more specific, right? They're going to say, write a paragraph with at least this many sentences with proper punctuation and grammar and blah, blah, blah. Well, then your child's goal could be to write a sentence with proper punctuation and grammar. So it's aligned, but not, you know, not the full standard if it's not something that's realistic for your child. It's a great question.
Thank you, Lisa. I am a core connector nerd, and I do love it. And Mandy asked a question, you know, which is a big, I'm sure a very sort of nerve-wracking, you know, preparation. How can we prepare for a transfer to another district? So get ready for that IEP, knowing that you're going to be transferring. What do parents need to do?
Yeah, that's actually a fun IEP because, I mean, the people who are in the IEP team are all humans, right? And if you're leaving the school, it can be easier. If you're leaving the district, it can be easier to get everything you want because they don't have to implement it.
Right. But I have heard that from many parents.
But on the flip side, right? If you tell them, "Oh, we're leaving," they might not be invested in working hard to get a good IEP for you. So you kind of gotta, you know, walk that balance. I would make sure if your child has areas that are very important, okay, like for example, they do need an aid, but they don't have one, right? So then I would make sure that it's noted in the IEP. If you can't get the aid, right, at least make sure that they put in the notes, you know, how much hands-on support the child needs, right? Or you can also have something added into the accommodations about close adult supervision needed for safety, because that doesn't mean aid, right? That just means we need to keep an eye on this kid. And I love getting that in accommodations because it can help you with other things like IHSS, just FYI. But if you can't, you know, get it documented right in the IEP, you know, what the school is doing for the child as far as keeping them safe, because even though the school may not need an aid, somebody is doing something if your child has safety concerns, for example. So
right. And I mean, obviously,
you know, and another thing too is I have a actual client with a similar situation right now where their child cannot test well on the academic tests, but the child can do a heck of a lot more than the academic tests show. And they are going somewhere new with this testing that's going to have them teaching this child far below where they're at. So she had them put in the notes from the teachers what they've actually observed while working with the child, what the child can and can't do, which is very different than the tests because the child is a child who doesn't speak with their mouth. And so the tests don't work well for him. So you can also do that.
I love that. And obviously every IEP, we want to really be able to show exactly what our child is doing, you know, and the things that we want them to be doing or that we're working towards, but especially if you're moving districts, right? Like, and maybe the team would be more open to writing some of those things, like when you're leaving, right? Like, but to really, you know, so then, because nobody wants to read a bad IEP and have that be the representation of your child at any time, but certainly starting over again. All right. So we've laid out, you know, we've done all this beautiful prep work, and it's not going to matter at all. And I see the time, so we can do this quickly, but it's not going to matter if we can't find anything during the IEP meeting, right? If we can't access what we need to know. So many of us started this journey with 3-ring binders, almost as tall as our kids. And nowadays, a lot of us build digital binders. And I have to give a shout out to our Undivided Super Binder. Undivided members have access to uploading and organizing all their child's documents in a digital super binder. It's stored right there in the Undivided app alongside our step-by-step guides and our parent resources. So everything they need is all in one place. It makes things really easy to access. But Lisa, how do you suggest that we arrange all this information, digital or paper, so that we can find what we need during the meeting? Because, you know, sometimes it feels like there's a million things going on and you don't want to be kind of flipping through, like, what was I going to say? Or where's that piece of information? Do you have any recommendations for parents?
Yeah, I think that whatever works, I mean, sorry, my answer is not great, but whatever works best for your brain. Finding a system is so important because the amount of information, papers, files, it can be overwhelming. I personally use a system that's both digital and paper, depending on what I'm actually doing. And I name my digital, I always think when I name my files, if I'm looking for this, what am I thinking it's called? Right? Mm-hmm. So instead of calling it like December OT report, I might put like, you know, December 2023 OT report where scissors was discussed or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. Because that's what I'm going to be thinking about. Another thing I'll do is I will like put little stickies on the paper copies, and when I go to meetings, and I'll label them like accommodations or whatever I know is an area that we need to talk about, so that when we get to that part in the meeting, I can flip to it instead of having to go through the 45-page IEP to find it. Yeah. So the most important thing is to find a system that works for your brain. Throwing it in a box over there in the corner isn't going to work because you're not going to be able to find what you need when you need it. So the app, the Undivided app, is amazing, and it seems to be getting better all the time, which is crazy because it was amazing to begin with. And I have lots of parents who have been using that and love it. So you just have to find a system that works for you.
Yeah. And I would also say, think about how, unless this is your first IEP and you don't know, think about how your IEP meetings are set up and how they run. The way it works for me is, I mean, I sort of organize by goal. So, you know, if it's sort of like starting with reading, and then I have all my notes there about like present levels or baselines, progress reports, the proposed goals, any of my data that I have from outside sources that are sort of backing up what I'm asking. And that's kind of how our meetings are run. And so after years, I mean, I found that's what works for me. But as you're kind of going, you know, through the years, you know, you'll kind of get like, what does it feel like? And you're going to know what works and doesn't. But it's, I mean, I remember in the first couple of years that I was doing it, I'd be sort of like looking back and forth, like trying to find what I was looking for. I thought I was organized, and then the meeting went a different way. So anyway, it does help, again, to think about like what works for your brain. That's exactly what you said, Lisa.
Well, and it's okay if you're looking, it is absolutely okay for you to say to the meeting, can everybody hold on 1 minute? I just need to find the report we're talking about, and ask them to stop. Will you look for it? It is okay. Remember, parental participation is one of the most important parts of an IEP meeting, and you have absolutely every right to ask for them to wait for you.
Absolutely. Yes. Which actually is another great point. I mean, what would you say, Lisa, of everything we talked about, but what is one of the most overlooked pieces of IEP prep that parents should pay attention to?
You know what? You said prep, so I'm going to say a planned, because you need to plan in advance for most people, a planned break for the parents later in the day to just unwind, and whether that's just going out for coffee with your partner or taking a bath or calling your best friend on the East Coast and talking for an hour, whatever it is, a planned break. So hire a sitter or send the kids to after school care or do what you can if at all possible. I know for some of you that's not possible, but if it's at all possible, plan a break later in the day where you try not to think about it and you just take a break, because it is emotional.
Right.
It
It
is.
is. It is. And actually, that's a really good point. I mean, we talked a lot about the logistics, but is there anything else that you want to say about the emotions around the IEP process? I know I saw some comments earlier on in the chat. People were talking about how emotional it can be. And I think sometimes that takes people by surprise, or sometimes you forget, it's in the recesses of your brain, but you're not really sort of shored up for it. What would you like to share with parents about that?
Yeah, I mean, first, bring a friend, bring an advocate, bring someone with you. I think that's important. I think that it's okay to cry in the meetings. It's okay to be emotional. It's okay to say, I need a break. Let's take a 10-minute bathroom break or whatever, right? It's your kid. I'm going to steal something that Lindsay has said before. This is your child's IEP team for a year. You're the child's IEP team for life. So you're the most important person in the room. Take a break, go to the bathroom. Your kid is still the same kid that your kid was before this meeting. The new diagnosis or the new behavior or the not meeting a goal or the whatever, it doesn't change. Your kid is still the same amazing kid he or she was before. And then the last thing, and you can out yourself in the comments if you want, because I know you're here. I have a client who told me that the kid that they present is not her kid. They would push life skills on her kid and say, this is all we're going to do with your kid. We want to teach your kid to cook. We want to do this. They would say the kid doesn't do math. The kid doesn't do this. I told her one time, you know what, just make a video and show it to them. And boy, did she took this to the next level. She took a compilation video. It was like 2 minutes now, every IEP, where she shows her kid doing all the things that they say the kid can't do and doing all of the life skills. And you can totally out yourself if you want, but I never ever tell on my clients who they are, but she's in the comments. And so they would say, well, we want to work on life skills with your kid. And she'd be like, look, I just showed you a video of them making omelets. Like, it is the most awesome thing. So if your team is down in your kid, make it reasonable, not 45-minute video, 1 or 2 minute little video you can present of your kid having the social skills, having a conversation back and forth, cooking, all of these things that they talk about your kids doing. And yes, I realize our kids can do things at home that are different than school, but if your kid knows how to cook an omelet, they don't need life skills for cooking.
Right.
Right. So, right. So
the videos, I have to say, I absolutely love that. Oh my gosh. I mean, that has to be really gratifying, number one, but obviously then to, show who your child is. And, and even having those reports, because I've had things said like, oh, yep, all year, haven't been able to get anything. And then I took out a work sample from a private therapy session where that had been accomplished in a 1 hour session of what they hadn't been able to do like in all year. You can say, okay, different things in school, but you can't really refute it. I mean, the omelet, that's amazing. Whoever you are, I want to know you. I want to spend time with you. It's genius.
I hope she outs herself, because she's an amazing, amazing, amazing mom.
Of course. Yes. I love that idea. And I feel like a lot of people are sort of nervous to bring that sort of personal into it. But nothing better than, just show them, right? You can say it all day long and they're not going to listen, but you really can't say anything to the omelet video, right? Forever be known as.
Well, I actually did it once with my own son, who really struggled with reading, and they talked about his reading level being far lower than I knew it was. So I took a video of him reading and presented it, and they were shocked.
Yeah.
And it was a refusal behavior at school, and I understand that, but my point is it can definitely help.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. And I'm looking at the time, and I know we have to wrap it up. We've covered so much, but then also an hour can barely scratch the surface, as everyone here knows. And we want you to leave today with an understanding of what's important for you to consider for your own IEP prep. You can take our checklist, make it your own. We just want you to feel confident in that IEP meeting. So remember, reach out to your child's team, gather reports and samples, talk about goals, ask questions about progress, organize everything you gather, note items of concern as well as priorities, prepare for your requests, and then go into your meeting with feelings of confidence and collaboration. Maybe plan on a little wine later, just saying. You've got this. You've got this. So thank you, Lisa, always for taking the multiverse of IEPs and highlighting where we need to focus and prepare, and for making things that seem so overwhelming make sense. So thank you always. And if you want a prep partner, just click on the Kickstart link in the chat that Donna shared. You can schedule with our care team right from that link. And while we covered IEP prep today, Lisa's going to be back. So we're going to cover the essentials of the actual IEP meeting on Monday, April 17th at 1 o'clock right here on our Facebook page. It's going to be the 5 most important things to remember when advocating in an IEP. We're going to take all this organization that we talked about today, and then we'll put it into action for the actual meeting. Donna's putting the RSVP info in the chat, so we would love to see you back here. And in the meantime, join us in our Parents Only Facebook group if you're not already in there. Lisa, the Undivided Navigators, and I, Donna, Iris, we're all in there with an amazing community of parents who are sharing everything from IEPs to puberty to summer camps and anything else you can imagine. Donna's going to share that link in the chat. And in the meantime, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and now Twitter. Stop by and say hello, because our mission is to support you so your children can thrive, and we want you to thrive too. So happy IEP season. We are here to help, and we hope to talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.